Hey guys, I'm Dave and welcome to the Trull Gallery. Today we're going to build a display cart for a local farm store. The crew at Meacham Urban Farms here in Tampa asked me if I could design and build some carts for their farm store. They need to be durable, able to take some weather, look nice, and be cost effective. I'm going to start with one. We'll make any changes to the design as we go, and then once that's complete, I can go ahead and crank out the rest. This sounds like my kind of challenge. I was given a rough sketch with a few parameters, but most importantly, each shelf had to hold several baskets that they can display produce in. This design will also include a slatted middle shelf that they'll use to display the bread they sell. As with most of my builds, the next step was to draw it up in SketchUp. My initial thoughts were to build them from 4/4 white oak, but that got pricey very quickly, so we adapted the design for 3/4 inch Baltic birch. Once we settled on the design, it was time to make a pattern. They'll be ordering several of these carts, and having a pattern for the sides will save a bunch of time during the build. I started with a piece of 1/2 inch plywood cut to the size of the cart sides, or 58 by 20 3/4, and then drew on the rails, stiles, and corner points and other details. Since I don't want any sharp edges on the carts, I started by defining the interior corners with a 1-inch diameter Forstner bit. Each corner was backed with some scrap ply to prevent blowout. Of the 10 holes drilled, only one had some minor blowout, and since this is the pattern, it's not a big deal. Then I grabbed my jigsaw and cut just inside my lines, removing the majority of the waste. Staying about 1/8 of an inch away from my lines will make cleanup easier. To clean up those lines, I clamped a straight edge in place. When I was happy with the location, I added a few 23 gauge pins to hold things together. Since I ran out of 3/4 inch pins, I had to clean up the tips of the pins that protruded through the pattern. A few swipes with a file took care of that, no problem. After securing everything to my work table, I used my palm router with a flush trim spiral bit. I defined the corners first, then went back and cleaned up those straight lines. The short sides were cleaned up in the same way, except my straight edge was the final width of the rails, so I could clean up both edges with one setup. A drum sander in my drill press made quick work of cleaning the corners. When they were all clean, I went back and gave those inner straight edges a quick sanding with my random orbit sander, blending everything in. I picked up some 3/4 inch Baltic birch and started to break it down with my track saw. Each sheet got one factory edge trimmed off, and then I cut the sheets to length of the longest part for that sheet. These pieces are still pretty awkward, so I took the time to cut the pieces to just over their final width. I made sure to leave them about 1/4 inch oversized so I could cut off the factory edges on the next step. Before cutting my shelves to width, I double-checked my measurement. I set 2 pieces of 3/4 inch ply in place at the edge of the side pattern and measured the remaining space. That worked out to 19 3/8, not exactly what was on my drawings. With the table saw fence set, the 2 shelves could be cut. The sides and rail were also cut to size while I was at the table saw. With all the parts cut to size, it was time to lay out the sides. I started by aligning and then clamping the pattern to a side and drawing the cutout in place. And I did the same for the second side. Cutting out the waste was pretty much the same as before. Drill access holes in the corners, making sure to minimize blowouts. Cutting the waste with my jigsaw. Aligning the pattern on the side and tacking it in place. And then cleaning things up with my palm router and that flush trim bit. While the pattern is still in place, I transfer the lines from the pattern to the sides. These marks represent the center of the rails. I marked the center rail, and then remember that only the front rail should be marked now. The location of the back rail will be determined later. I was a bit gentler removing the pattern so I wouldn't damage the sides. A putty knife gave me some working room for a wide chisel, and I worked my way around the pattern. The last step was to remove the pins. The difference here is that I used a putty knife to prevent the vice grips from denting the sides. Oh, and lever those pins out slowly. If you rush it, you run a greater risk of snapping one of the pins, and the shorter they are, the harder it is to get a bite on. I thought I'd try out my new Rockler dowel jig on this project. Each of the rails got a center mark, and the jig was aligned to that. I set my bit depth to just over an inch, since I planned to use 1.5-inch long pins. When all the rails were drilled, it was time to work on the sides. This took a bit of head scratching, since there's no place to clamp it in the orientation I need to drill. To get around that, I clamped on a thick spacer and made sure it was in plane with the edge of the side. Now I can set the jig in place and clamp it to the spacer. Now we can drill the top and bottom rails on both sides of both pieces. The flat shelves will have 3-inch rails front and back. That many dowels would drive me crazy, so I decided to lay out for biscuits. Each rail was clamped in place. I made sure the ends were flush with the shelf, and then transferred the lines from the shelf to the rail. I made sure to set the rails in the correct orientation, and marked each rail to its respective shelf face in case my tick marks are a bit off. The final step was to mark the inside of the rails so I'd remember which face gets the biscuit slots. The next day I started by cutting the biscuit slots on both sides of the two shelves. Then I clamped several rails together to provide some support while I cut the slots in each of the 4 rails. Because I want to use every joinery jig I own, I decided to add the end dowel holes with my vintage Jig-It dowel jig. This is self-centering, and I set my depth stop for a 1-inch cut into the shelf. Both shelves got 2 holes on either end. I set my router table with a 1/4-inch roundover bit and eased the edge of 3 sides on each rail. The inside edge closest to the biscuit slots stayed square since the shelves will be flush to that edge. After sanding the inside faces of the rails and shelves, it was time to glue them together. I put a bit of glue on each slot in the rails and then inserted a number 20 biscuit in each slot. Then I added a bead of glue to one edge of the shelf and inserted it to the first rail and got the ends close to alignment. A bead of glue on the other rail, and it was time to line up the ends of all 3 pieces. Once I was happy with the location, I tightened each clamp. The shelf was set aside to dry while I clamped up the second shelf in the same way. After sanding all the parts, it was time to add those secondary dowel locations to the sides. I'll do that with these dowel points. They come in several sizes, and I'll use the 3/8 version to match the holes I drilled in the end of the shelves. I started by putting dowels in each of the sides for the rails, and I put a dowel point in the shelf. The dowels ensure the shelf is in the correct location, and then a few taps of the mallet drive the points into the side. With the side removed, you can just see the dents that the points left. A bit of pencil lead helps make them more visible, or you can just go ahead and use an awl to better define the locations. I marked the bottom of this side the same way. To mark the opposite side, I moved the dowel points to the other side of the shelf and set the shelves back in place in the first side. Now I can wrestle the second side in place and give it a few taps with the hammer to mark the other 4 points. You could drill these holes by hand with a 3/8 inch bit, but why not pull out one more tool? This drill guide not only ensures that my holes are perpendicular to the face, it also has a depth stop to ensure I go deep enough but not blow through the other side. It was time for a full dry assembly. I put 6 dowels on each side and then set the top and bottom shelf in place. Then I can add the second side. Just take your time. The more dowels you have to line up, the fussier it gets. Now we just have to stand it up to work on the center shelf. Something told me this wouldn't work, and it didn't. Nothing that a little more sanding can't fix. My longest clamps were too short, so I ran out to the truck and grabbed my ratchet straps. I put just enough tension on the bottom strap to hold things in place while I planned my next move. This wasn't it. After a little thought, I added a brace on either side to temporarily support the shelf while I got it in place. I also added a corner clamp to each side to provide a little more stability while I worked. With that done, I think I can get the upper shelf in place. It was still a little sketchy, but I finally got everything lined up and added a second ratchet strap. The center shelf will get the same 3-inch rails that the other shelves have, and the design showed a 20-degree angle on it, and laid out the location on the front rail. From there, I determined where the shelf itself would start and drew a 20-degree line on each side. I used that line as a guide to clamp 2 temporary rails in place and dropped in a piece of scrap plywood just to get a visual of the final assembly. Once Farmer Joe gives me the approval on this setup, I'll make the real slatted shelf. 2 changes came during his visit. First, the top rail needs to be cut to 1.5 inches, which I chose not to video, and it was kind of sketchy. The second was to change the orientation of the middle slats. They were drawn front to back, but they'd prefer them to be side to side. To start the center shelf, I'd run a dado in the 2 side pieces. It's a 1/2 inch up from the bottom, 3/8 of an inch deep, and just wide enough to accept 1/2 inch plywood. Those angle sides will be attached to their rails with the same rockler dowel jig, and I had to get a little creative again to drill the rails. I'll work on that problem with the holes interfering with each other after I've got the shelf assembled. The sides were easier to drill. I just had to make sure the bit depth was shallow enough that it wouldn't penetrate the top of the piece. Despite checking twice, I still managed to blow through on the first piece. Since that's the top and it would be visible, I just remade it. With the frame of the shelf dry assembled, I could mark the location of the groove on the rails. With the same dado set, I ran the grooves in the rails. Unfortunately, I wasn't thinking clearly, and I ran the grooves square to the face. They should have been cut at a 20-degree angle. I came back later and then tweaked the grooves so that the slats would fit cleanly. Now I could rip 7 slats at 1.25 inches and 2 a bit wider to sit in the grooves of the rails. Those 2 are wider so they'll match the rest of the slats once they're in place. Each rail had one end squared at the miter saw, and then I set a stop to cut them all to length. They got the same quarter round on all the edges and were sanded smooth. I switched over to my palm router and eased the edges of the unit's sides. The inside of the frame was rounded on both faces, but only the outside edges were cleaned up. I'll round over the inside edges once the entire unit is assembled. With all the slats in place, I could measure the amount of space available, and I came up with 7.5 inches. I divided that by 8 spaces I needed, and that gave me 0.9375 or 15/16. I milled up a strip of stock to that size using my planer and digital calipers. I cut that into 2-inch spacers, and once I put them in place, I had just a bit of slop. After putting 2 pieces of blue tape on each spacer, I had nice, even spacing. I knew this shelf would be a complex glue-up, so I decided to glue it in stages. I started by gluing the outermost slats in their grooves and clamping them in place. I made sure to keep the glue away from the angled sides, since I have to be able to take that assembly apart for the next step. I worked one side at a time to glue the frame together. First gluing in the dowels, then adding the long rail to the angled sides. Once both sides were glued, I used some clamping blocks cut at 20 degrees to help clamp the assemblies together. A quick check for square, and the assembly was set aside to dry. To secure the rest of the slats, I placed a spacer at each end, brought the slat in snug, and made a light pencil mark at both ends. Then I could slide the slat away, add a bit of glue between the marks, and slide the slat back in against the spacer. I worked my way all the way across until all of the slats were secured. Once that had time to dry, I milled up 3 support slats. They matched the long slats, but they were only rounded on one face, and they have a 20-degree angle on both ends. After marking out their locations, I drew some guidelines inside those marks to let me know where to put the glue. Then the strips were clamped in place and secured with some 23-gauge pins. I wanted to locate the casters before assembly. I set them in from the corner so the lock would be accessible but not sticking out too far. Then I marked each hole with my awl before drilling the mounting holes with a 9/32 bit. That'll give me a little wiggle room for the 1/4" machine screws I'll be using. I backed each location with some scrap to prevent blowout. The bottom shelf was turned over, and each hole was countersunk for the head of the machine screw. If you remember, when I drilled the second set of holes in that center shelf, a few of them intersected with the first set of holes. Now that the glue has had time to dry, I went back and re-drilled the side holes to make sure I could get the dowel pins in there. After another dry assembly, I could mark the location of the center rear rail on the sides. I marked the back of each piece with blue tape to remind me where the back of each piece is, and then I drilled the sides like before. It's finally time for assembly. Knowing this would also be a complex glue-up, I started by gluing the dowel pins into the 3 shelves. A bead of glue on one end of each shelf, and they could be connected to the first side. 2 reasons to use Titebond 3 on this build. 1, the shelves may very well live outside, and 2, it has a longer open time, which is great for complex glue-ups like this. When the shelves are attached to the first side, I added a bead of glue to the other end of the shelves and set the second side in place. Then it was time to add the clamps and check for square. This process took 12 minutes, but it seemed much longer at the time. I talked to the crew at the farm to choose a stain for the shelf, and I was asked to add 1 more brace for that center shelf. Apparently they stand the bread up and needed something for it to lean on. 1 more piece of 3/4" ply cut to size and rounded over. In the future I'll use more dowels, but since the piece is already assembled, it's held in place with some 2" stainless steel screws. And speaking of screws, I decided to strengthen the unit with screws at each shelf. I pre-drilled with my countersink bit, but even still the stainless screws had trouble stripping out. So I drove in some regular cabinet screws, pulled them out, and then followed with the stainless screws. With everything in place, I could finally clean up the inside edge of the sides. Doing this now prevents the roundover from looking strange where the rails meet the sides. After a bit of sanding, we're ready for finish. Before finishing, I set my pattern next to one of the sides and transferred any additional marks that I didn't have. This includes the pilot holes for the screws. When I come back to build the next 3 or 4, this will save time and effort as I know where everything goes. The screw holes are even drilled with an 1/8" bit, so I can drill them when I've got the pattern attached to the new side pieces. Some people really hate to paint. Me, I hate to stain. It took an hour and a half to stain the rack. I thought it would look great with a natural finish, but the customer wanted something a little darker. After 3 coats of Total Boats Halcyon on the bottom of the shelf, I attached the casters. Each one was held in place with 4 1" long 1/4" machine screws and nuts. I didn't think I had enough clearance to get an 1¼ bolt in there, but I'll try that next time. The 1" fasteners are just too short to include a washer under the nut. Again, I went with stainless steel since I just know these carts will get wet. The next day, I wiped down the stain with denatured alcohol. If you're wondering why, I explain that in a video that I'll link below. After that, I applied 3 coats of Halcyon. I did give it a light sanding by hand with 220 paper before the 3rd coat. Nothing left to do now but take it down to the farm and see what they think. The crew loves the shelf, which is great because I plan on making 3 or 4 or 6 more of them. This one took just under 30 hours to complete, and I hope to get that cut down in half now that I've got the pattern and can do all the setup all at once. I'd love to hear your thoughts on this video. Is there something I could have done different, easier, smarter, safer? Drop them in the comments below. And as usual, I've added links to some of the tools and equipment I used during this build, and should you happen to need one of those things and buy it through those links, it does help support this channel. If you enjoyed this video, maybe give us a thumbs up and share it with friends. If you haven't already, maybe it's time to hit that subscribe button and little bell so you get notified each time I put out a new video. As usual, I don't have a clue what's coming up next, but whatever it is, it should be something interesting. So until then, have a great day, stay safe, and see you soon.